My name is Anna Ridler. I'm an artist and researcher based in London. My practice kind of brings together the scientific, the academic, and the artistic, and kind of sits between all of those three spaces. It spans kind of photography, installation, generative work, writing, sound. And I'm very interested in systems of knowledge and how knowledge is made and formed and kept, which has kind of led me into working with machine learning and artificial intelligence. And part of this interest kind of, I suppose, comes about by taking the technology that I'm working with and unpicking it. So kind of when I work, I do everything from kind of like building the systems, building the data set, and then building the kind of final output installation, whatever it is. And I think by doing all of that process, you can kind of understand how things are created, and by that kind of like understanding, see what kind of histories, connotations, associations are embedded in all of these parts of technology. So for me, one of the things that I'm really interested in is using this new technology and using these new ways of thinking as a way of kind of really exploring and understanding the world. I did a lot of work in linguistics as part of that degree, and a lot of work on dictionaries, and kind of like the whole question of kind of building a dictionary is trying to record the world, is trying to kind of like accurately kind of define everything. And that's exactly what you're doing when you're building a data set. You're trying to kind of like create a world and kind of define everything in it. And both are incredibly futile tasks. And both are inherently kind of caught up with questions of power, because, you know, who is deciding this? Who is defining something? Who is agreeing that definition? You know, is it top down or bottom up, or kind of like how is this kind of, who controls these systems? And so all those questions around ontology, around meaning, around language that were very much there as part of an English literature degree are also, I think, very kind of like core to what I'm doing now. I think that I am not that worried at the moment about kind of machines taking over humans as artists. I mean, I think sometimes like because I think it depends on how you define art, what is art. And for me, that's always comes back to kind of what is the concept behind the piece? What is the artist trying to say, and how? As an artist, I'm not that worried. For me, I find it actually quite liberating. Like there's kind of like all these ways of working that kind of weren't possible, you know, like 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 5 years ago. And it's just opening up and kind of allowing me to do things that, you know, and explore things and find out things that kind of weren't possible before. I think actually kind of like one of the other movements that I compare a lot my practice to is land and environmental artists, who also kind of like couldn't control necessarily what their final piece would be like, because they were having to work with kind of like elements with wind, water, rain, kind of like and I think that's quite similar to working how I work. You spend a lot of time kind of planning and building and preparing and shaping things, but the actual artwork itself, you can kind of like never really control what it will be. And also a lot of the artwork kind of exists through documentation. It exists through kind of MP4 files or JPEGs or PNGs or recordings, and rather than being the kind of actual kind of like AI machine learning model itself. I think as like a lot of the time I'm working with quite experimental technology, a lot of the time is frustration, because the way that I work, like I have an idea of what I want it to be, and then a lot of the time is just trying to get to that idea. And a lot of the time kind of like the really impressive results that you see kind of like are the result of kind of like, you know, like teams of PhD people kind of like working away on it. And so a lot of the time it's very frustrating to try and kind of like get close to what you want. And then there are moments of just like absolute wonder when it does work, and like that's enough to balance it out. like you asked kind of earlier about what do you worry about in the kind of like creativity and in this space. And one of the things that I do worry about, or do you think about, is the cost of hardware and environmental cost of kind of creating these things. Because the way that industry is going is that it's kind of, if you look at like the latest things that are being produced, they require, like 50 GPUs to be training for like 2 months or whatever, which is impossible to replicate on a small scale, or impossible for an artist to kind of use or kind of build from the ground up. And so I worry that kind of like you'll end up in this system where people will be locked out of kind of using it because of the cost of having to train it, and they'll rely on kind of pre-trained models, or they'll rely on code that only works kind of like on certain machines, and that the experimentation that is happening kind of like on the edges, where like the really interesting stuff that is happening, you won't be able to access unless you have kind of like an institution who can sponsor you. I wish I was better than I am, because I'm not a computer scientist. So for the best one in the world, all I'm doing is really kind of like tweaking and kind of changing something that already exists. And there are things there are ideas that I would love to make, that I'm just not quite there yet, that aren't possible. And so I kind of like have in the back of my notebook a list of ideas, and then a list of things that I'm experimenting with and trying to make, and then every so often they'll join together and I come up with a project. But I think I have a desire to be better at that, because I think like with everything, the more that you know, the more that you understand the more that you do yourself, the more you can kind of like understand what's going on and ask the right questions, and kind of like find the thing that is genuinely interesting, rather than just taking the assumptions that other people have given you. I don't know what it will be like in like 50 years time, but I think kind of like the artificial intelligence that kind of currently exists is still very brittle, it's still very basic. And I think that like it doesn't have intelligence that we mean intelligence. And I think that's a whole other conversation about like what does intelligence mean, because like we kind of like form so much of our conception of kind of intelligence around human intelligence, when of course there are loads of other non-human intelligences. And maybe AI won't become intelligent like we think of intelligence. Maybe it will become intelligent like an octopus, or like another type of thing. To go back to your question, I don't think it is there yet, but I don't know what the future holds either.